a different direction.
And someone who's been there is Jim DeMint's. He's president of the Heritage Foundation and a former Republican senator from South Carolina. Senator, good to see you this morning. First of all, we just heard the new senator from West Virginia say that small victories potentially are possible. Do you think that is possible to score small victories, bipartisan victories, with this president?
Well, we hope so, Eric. He's indicated with some of the things he's going to do on his own that maybe he doesn't want to do that, but the new Senator Capito is right, particularly on issues like energy, where we could take some small steps, Keystone Pipeline, reducing regulations on coal, which would certainly affect her area, move the country towards energy leadership in the world. Those are the kind of things that are big ideas, but we could take a number of small steps to move us in the right direction.
But, you know, the American people don't want small steps. They want action. And here you have a president who largely has been saying it's my way or the highway, who won't compromise. You talk about immigration, he's going to just put that through no matter what Congress says. How does the Republican Senate react to that?
Well, it really will, as someone has said, be like throwing a hand grenade in the middle of Congress as they're trying to come up with an agenda, pass a spending bill, work on big issues like energy independence or more opportunity in education to solve the problems of the country. If the president creates another problem, then I'm not sure where it'll end up, but I think Republicans and responsible members of the House and the Senate need to move ahead as if the president might work with them at this point.
The president was a senator, of course, before he was elected. He was a state senator in Springfield. What do you think he learned? I mean, when you're in the Senate, when you're in a legislative body, you have to learn to work together, even with people who are members of the opposite party and across the aisle. What lessons did he not learn from that experience?
Well, I think the president is an ideologue. He has this vision of America that's very different than mine and a lot of other Americans. I came into the Senate at the same time that Barack Obama did, but he almost immediately began working to run for president, did very little in the Senate, so he showed very little interest in working with people even when he was in the Senate. So I don't know what to expect of him. I had hoped after this election that he would do as others like Bill Clinton did and look for ways to actually accomplish something. But his attitude so far, based on the meeting last Friday and the conversations with members who were there, it doesn't appear that he's listening. It appears he's still talking.
What was it like, and has he changed?
Well, one-on-one, I mean, he was, a decent person, it seemed, but very aloof, I think, from other members of the Senate. And particularly now, he seems very arrogant as he approaches his job. Now,
some would say he's just sticking to his principles, that he has his beliefs, and that's what he was elected because, in his famous words once, he said, you know, I won. How about that reaction?
Well, the president takes an oath of office to faithfully execute the laws. It's not his job to create the laws. So when he says, if Congress doesn't act, I will, that's against his oath of office. It's against the Constitution. He is supposed to faithfully execute the laws that are passed by Congress. He needs to work with them to pass some laws that will move our country in the right direction, not create them on his own.
And finally, do you think that we will have some bipartisan action or these small steps eventually, or do you think after a few months it will just be more of the same?
Well, we can hope. I think a lot of Republicans are coming in with the energy to move the country in the right direction, to work with anyone who will take the country in the right direction. So let's just hope at this point that new energy coming into the House and the Senate will move the president in the right direction.
All right, Senator Jim DeMint, they got the scaffolding up there on the Capitol. Hope when it comes down they can get something done, but the new year will tell. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Eric.